Biodiversity conservation cannot function in isolation, and our stalwarts have set the path to follow this thought in the early times. We have been coordinating with local communities, government, and even the media to spread awareness about nature conservation and also involve the common public in conservation efforts. BNHS organized the first nature trail in early 1920s to involve more and more people and educate them about nature. The Satpura Landscape Tiger Program is one such initiative where our association with the Forest Department and local communities has brought about a positive change towards tiger conservation.
Taking this legacy forward, we are now stepping into the forests of Northeast India. Along with numerous threatened species, the forest of Northeast is also home to numerous indigenous communities who are culturally rooted with their forests. They own extensive forest land which act as bridges between protected areas for wildlife. Their role in conserving these landscapes assumes great significance and was also recognized at the recently held IUCN Congress in Hawaii. We are in the process of associating with the Idu Mishmi tribe in Mishmi Hills to explore and establish a long-term approach for conservation. With increasing development pressures in Northeast India, it's high time to direct long-term conservation initiatives in this habitat.
We now call upon stage Mr. Satish Pradhan, long-standing member of Governing Council of the BNHS. He is also the brand ambassador and advisor for the Satpura Landscape Tiger Program. And also, he is guiding us for the capability building for young scientists. He has served as the head of HR at the Tata Group. So please.
It's a pleasure to be here to speak particularly and be invited to speak on subjects which you're passionate about. So if I err on this side of the clock, suffer me and forgive my passion and maybe a bit of ignorance as well. Homi referred to the pressures that we face and the challenges that look at us as we go forward. Deepak referred to the responses that we are trying to generate to be able to deal with this emergent, varying, and different world that we are walking into, with a desire to leave something significantly different and more impactful after 266 years. So the grandchildren of the grandchildren of the grandchildren of our grandchildren, that really is the legacy that we have inherited and therefore are burdened with the responsibility of perpetuating a heritage that endures as well in the same kind of time horizon. In my little that I tried to learn on management, one of the pieces of wisdom I picked up was, if you try and solve a problem by trying to do something which you've always done to address that problem with limited success, chances that doing more of that same will result in a different outcome are pretty remote. So, which brings us back to what Deepak talked about. We've got to do some things which are different. And what we've learned over 133 years is the reality that conservation does not happen in isolation, economic development does not happen in isolation, and communities and societies don't thrive as social entities in isolation. And these are not three academic subjects to be housed in a university and studied independently for the student to integrate. This is an integrated reality of life. That's what we've learned from our 133 years of legacy. If we want to make any impact in any conservation context, if we do not have the commitment, the psychological sense of ownership, and increasingly, as I will speak today, the physical sense of ownership of a landscape, of a species, of an intervention, we are likely to be very limited in the success we get. If there is no economic worth and value that this whole venture generates, we are likely to be unsuccessful, if not very limited in our success. And so these are the three threads that have brought us to look at this difference. And before we go any further, I'd like to significantly appreciate Ipra Makola, who's a classic representative of a community that is both economically savvy, societally evolved, and committed to its own well-being as seen in the context. These are representatives of community who have evolved far beyond many of us urban creatures, with claims to, with due respect to all my doctoral, double doctoral and postdoctoral friends, they are far wiser and far more knowledgeable and role models for people like us in terms of the quality of commitment and the willingness to act. Thank you, sir, for being here with us. I will draw upon you as we go forward. So here is where we started this thinking. And I must say, as a word of humble learning, which is what we all call our mistakes, we have played around with this idea of conservancies outside state protection areas, protected areas, for a couple of years, if not a little longer. And the reality is, we've learned some hard lessons and taken some hard knocks. And Deepak and I have been partners in crime in reaching out, touching the fire and drawing back, saying, we've got to think about this deeper, and then reached this kind of a stage. So challenges that we talk about, and I want to focus on one dimension of the biggest challenge we face. The conservation world is divided, and I'm being a bit exaggerating to make the point, between the protected areas which seek to protect species and landscape, and what I call the unprotected area, where there is very little evidence of any protection, except when it is owned by the communities. And we have enough evidence in this country that there is protection outside the protected areas by the communities. And that was one source of inspiration. The other part of it is, I mean, with due respect, we all know this, animals have no respect for what we call protected, unprotected, or whatever. And they have their own logic, illogic, and patterns across all taxa. Insects will not respect this, avifauna will not, mammals will not, reptiles will not. None of your species is going to respect any such boundaries. The other part of the paradox that I think is increasingly taking us into a corner which is very difficult to exit is the fact that there is a set of laws and regimen, many of which are helpful, and I think we need to respect them and encourage the respect for them, and many of them actually put us in a bind or a corner, again, which is very difficult to get out of. So, protection and ownership of wildlife belongs to the state. I think it's a very appropriate thing that wildlife belongs to the state. And you don't have people like African park owners who come and have conversations with some of us, and somehow people like me get irritated for the wrong reasons, who tell you, oh, I have 30,000 head of wildebeest in my park. And you say, hello, you have? In this country, the nation has, the state has, the people have. I don't have, you don't have. That kind of thing is something we learned as a lesson to be careful of. Having said that, one other dimension which emerges from here is that if we don't address this issue, and we are seeing, particularly in the area that I am more passionate about, the central India landscape, we are building 1,500, 1,000 square kilometer glorified, isolated zoos. Sometimes even with chain links around them and consequences which are quite disastrous. If we are not able to provide the flow of movement for species, given the pressures of development on one side, the need to create highways and railroads, the need for construction and development, we will end up with statements which I can't make sense out of. I heard a leader say about a biodiversity park in Pune, the only way to conserve that green cover of the biodiversity park is to construct on it. There must have been something wrong with my hearing or my brain, but that was the statement made. And we are ending up with having to make such statements coming from people who we know are bestowed with significant intellect and understanding. So that's a trap that we've got to walk away from. The other trap is the issue of ownership. I have a very sort of passionate view that the minute we go down the slippery slope of individual or corporate entity or private entity owned conservancies, the issue of land ownership and the dynamics of land and water and natural resources as a scarce subject on which much warfare can and is beginning to happen will become a dynamic that takes the agenda away from conservation to some completely different agenda. And therefore, to me, the beauty, the attractiveness, the viability, the long-term sustainability of a concept which is embedded in the ownership of the community, physical ownership of the community, as a necessary condition for the success of any such venture. So two sets of roles that we see being played by such a conservancy. Very clearly, this has to be an expression of what the community believes. If you're not resonating with that, all our good intentions of conservation, all our good intentions of wanting to do the right thing are just good intentions. The thing that puts wood behind the arrows is people like Ipra and the community he represents. If their commitment is solid and deeply embedded in their culture and tradition, it will find its own way like water flowing downhill. So, while protecting these biodiversity spots, providing buffers, corridors, and linkages and critical ecosystem services is core and center stage. Not unimportant are traditional knowledge. I normally am a fairly sort of sober conservative dresser. I chose to wear this today. And the reason is not because I was feeling fashionable or wanted to be with it. But this represents the traditional ikat knowledge of Odisha, for which this shirt company is paying design and part, that is this collar piece, rates as they would pay to any other designer and producer. And that is going back to the community whose both intellectual property and physical effort is being legitimately respected by the money on the table for this contribution to their shirts. And I see this as symbolic of the kind of work that we can do in these communities and make sure we disintermediate economic value from the intermediaries and take it straight back to the communities and provide mechanisms for viability of economic incomes and so on. But that heart of it is the cultural piece. So why Mishmi Hills? This is a very good list of reasons. In sheer numbers and categories, more compelling than most places. That's one very important part of it. And it's reason enough for us to start trying to do something different in a place like this. I'm not going to go into the details of the species. I'm not going to go into the details of the hotspot. Many of you here probably know more about it than I do. But I do see enough reason for this to be a place where we do very serious work and commit ourselves to try and live the philosophy that Homi and Deepak have talked about. Sorry, philosophy and the strategy that they have respectively talked about. The list of critically endangered, endangered, near threatened is quite large, and significant impact can be achieved if we are able to work in this space in the manner that we envision. We can create significant outcomes. Some of the species. So what is distinctive about this place? One is that it has critical size. It has critical size, and it has a community which has its arms around that space. And most importantly, it is perhaps one of the most significant biodiversity hotspots for us in this country, and perhaps even globally. So that's a visual, gives you a sense of where in the state it is, and gives you a sense of, I don't think that the satellite image is very clear, but it gives you a sense of fairly dense, rich, potentially having the power to light up the eyes of all of BNHS and its friends and well-wishers, in addition, of course, to the species and the community. So here is what we are trying to deliver. Most critical, I think, we start with is the ability to create appropriate self-governance. Why am I stating it in that way? This is not going to be run by some outsiders. This is not going to be run by other people, quote unquote, other. This is something that the community will decide and operate. Hugely helped, not left alone, hugely helped by a whole lot of inputs and support that can be provided, ranging from financial to services to training to hand-holding, the whole shooting match. It may be more difficult, it may be more time-consuming to try and say we will not move unless we have self-governing mechanisms in the community. But I think the benefit of that will be huge and well worth having worked hard for. Conservation and protection clearly is something we must deliver. That's at the heart of all of this. The cultural meaning and community relevance. I have a sociologist friend who's worked for his lifetime with the Jarawa tribals in the Andaman Islands. From the time that they were not in human contact with the rest of us, to a point in time where they have got integrated on their terms through the interventions that have been managed by various stakeholders in taking them to that stage. And I genuinely believe that anything that you do, even in an urban community, cannot be disconnected from its cultural meaning and its fundamental beliefs. A community like we are talking about has more coherence in many ways and more diffusion in many ways. But it will require a commitment and a respect to those meanings of that community if we are really going to be able to get some progress on the conservation front as well. The economic viability, I will not underemphasize or overemphasize. I think it constitutes another foundational bedrock. If the income generation and the income viability of that income generation is not on a sound financial basis, we will have failed. We will have failed the community, we will have failed ourselves, and we will have failed the environment. So that's something which we have to bring to bear in the manner and the shape that we help the community to really get value for not just its traditional knowledge, but for also its ongoing contributions to the economic framework, not in terms of extractive, destructive, and other opportunities. So these are some of the elements with which we see opportunities to go forward. Clearly requires capability building, clearly requires a lot of investment and effort, which I'm happy to say that I have the director's commitment that this is something which we will pursue with persistence, tenacity, and commitment. And we are here in this for the long term. So that's something which we stand committed to. First steps, I think it's important to get some of these few things right. We need to establish geographical boundary. so that we know what we're talking about in terms of the extent of it. We also need to progress pretty quickly on the biodiversity register to be able to capture the intellectual property and the cultural rights of the community, going all the way through to traditional knowledge and populating the traditional knowledge database as well. And then the governance mechanisms and the ways of going ahead and doing things. Lots of investment in developing a business model, viable, meeting all the criteria, investing in the training, the development, the fulfillment of the aspirations of the community in a way that they want, not what we want, or not what other stakeholders want. I think that's going to be a path we'll have to walk very carefully and with great sensitivity. The final one is, we have a good reference site like this. We can do much, much more in replicating it and persuading others that this works. The big strength we have from the Idu Mishmi belief structure and the culture and the social context that they have is a deep and fundamental belief in the notion of a wholeness of the universe and the ecosystems that we live in. The biodiversity register of the people is going to be another thing. And aligning the community and mobilizing their commitment in action to deliver some of these fruits in a sustainable way is where we want to get to. That's where we want to end up. And I'd like to thank you all for your patience. Too many of you have jumped around and indicated restlessness and borne with my passion. I'm grateful to you. But I will look forward to being more grateful to you on behalf of BNHS for the support and mobilization of resources and energies that we will inevitably need for this first pilot, and to take this forward as a new way of additionally engaging in conversation, in conservation in this country and maybe beyond. So thank you very much. I'd like to invite Ipra on stage here. He is very modest but very honored to have you. He is a significant member of the Arunachal Wildlife Board and chairs it. And he is the honorary wildlife warden for Dibang Valley, Mishmi Hills. And he speaks for the community in a very, very coherent, very inclusive, and a very decisive way. I'd like you all to give a huge welcome to him thank you very much. I'd like to invite Homi as president to come on stage and felicitate him. Deepak, if you would come up here as director and exchange a copy of the memorandum that we signed earlier today. Will you take this back? Thank you very much, sir. Thanks, Deepak. Thank you for me. Thank you very much.